All right, guys, check, 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 check. It's probably going to be staticky because I just turned this on. So, first part of Niccolo Machiavelli, the discourses, very fascinating, extremely fascinating. So, this is called the Discourses on the First 10 Books of Titus Livy. Niccolo Machiavelli to Zenobi Buondelmonte and Cosimo Rucellai, greeting. So, again, he writes something just like when he wrote um, the Prince was a gift to the Medici family. Now this one is a gift to, I guess, Zenobi Buondelmonte and Cosimo Rucellai. So book one are the development of Rome's constitution. So it treats of the constitutional development which took place in Rome from the time of the kings down to the year 387 BC, when the conquest of Italy began, and is based on Livy. Books 1 through 6, the first 10 chapters form an introduction. Mm, Anyway, so book one, the development of Rome's constitution, begins with the preface. So what happens here? So the more so when I see that in the civic disputes which arise between citizens and in the diseases men get, they always have recourse to decisions laid down by the ancients and to prescriptions they drew up. For the civil law is nothing but a recollection of decisions made by jurists of old. One finds neither prince nor republic who repairs to antiquity for examples. Books of Titus Livy, comparing ancient with modern events. So it's a preface. So he's Machiavelli speaking about what he's getting into. He, even in the beginning right here, he says, although owing to the envy inherent in man's nature, has always been no less dangerous to discover new ways and methods than to set off in search of new seas and unknown lands, because most men are much more ready to belittle than to praise another's actions. Nonetheless, impelled by the natural desire, I have always had to labor, regardless of anything, on that which I believe to be more that I believe to be for the common benefit of all. I've decided to enter upon a new way as yet untrodden by anyone else. Remember, he's writing this book on, this is a political philosophy. This is what we call political philosophy. So it's going to be political, right? So he's writing a history of, of ways to govern. Book one, the best form of government. This is discourses 1 through 10. So book one, the best form of government. Number one, concerning the origin of cities in general and of Rome in particular. Those who read of the origin of the city of Rome, of its legislators, and of its constitution will not be surprised that in this city such great virtue was maintained for so many centuries, and that later on there came into being the empire into which that republic developed. So all cities are built either by natives of the place in which they are built or by people from elsewhere. The first case comes about when inhabitants dispersed in many small communities find that they cannot enjoy security, since no one community of itself, owing to its position and to the smallness of its numbers, is strong enough to resist the onslaught of an invader. And when the enemy arrives, there is no time for them to unite for their defense, or if there be time, they have to abandon many of their strongholds and thus at once fall as prey to their enemies. Hence, to escape these dangers, either of their own accord or at the suggestion of someone of greater authority among them, such communities undertake to live together in some place they have chosen in order to live more conveniently and the more easily to defend themselves. To give some examples, this was the case with Athens and Venice, among many others. Athens was built under the authority of Theseus for reasons such as these by inhabitants who were dispersed, Venice by numerous peoples who had sought refuge in certain islets at the top of the Adriatic Sea, and that they might escape the wars which daily arose in Italy after the decline of the Roman Empire. Um, so interesting. There was, I guess, one of these cities. I guess it was considered to be Venice. Um, this happened because the long repose the situation afforded them, and that the sea at their end had no exit, and the peoples who were ravaging Italy had no ships in which to infest them. This being so, a beginning, however small, sufficed to bring them to their present greatness. Mm. So just giving examples of different places. Remember, he's going to talk about Rome. These may be either cities they find in countries they have occupied and in which they go to dwell, as Moses did, or new cities they build. Okay, so in this case, the virtue of the builder is discernible in the fortune of what was built, for the city is more or less remarkable according to as he is more or less virtuous who is responsible for the start. This virtue shows itself in two ways. First, in the choice of a site to build a civilization, and secondly, in the drawing up of laws. Since men work either of necessity or by choice, and since there is found to be greater virtue where choice has less to say to it, the question arises whether it would not be better to choose a barren place in which to build cities, so that men would have to be industrious and less given to idleness, and so would be more united, because owing to their poor situation there would be less occasion for discord. So to start your new city, knowing that all men are going to be put to work to establish that new city, he's going to get to an idea here that I found fascinating. Is it better to do that or find a city already established? As happened in Ragusa and in many other cities built in such like places, such a choice would undoubtedly be wiser and more advantageous were men content to earn their own living and not anxious to lord it over others. Since, however, security for man is impossible unless it be conjoined with power, it is necessary to avoid sterile places and for cities to be put in very fertile places where, when expansion has taken place owing to the fruitlessness of the land, it may be possible for them both to defend themselves against attack and to overcome any who stand in the way of the city's greatness. As to the idleness which such a situation may encourage, it must be provided for by laws imposing that need to work which the situation does not impose. So he talks about the characteristics of a good land that brings upon idleness, like land that's already established and there's no work for anybody because it's already done, or it creates idleness in which that people get restless and start to do, or land that is not good at all. People have no purpose in life and it creates chaos. It is advisable here to follow the example of those wise folk who have dwelt in the most beautiful and fertile lands, in such lands as tend to produce idleness and ineptitude for training in virtue of any kind, and who, in order to obviate the disasters which the idleness induced by the amenities of the land might cause, have imposed the need for training on those who were to become soldiers, and have made this training such that men have become better soldiers than those in countries which were rough and sterile by nature. So because your land is like already prospering over here and here, and there's nothing else for you guys to do, it might be arbitrary in a way. Now I'm speaking out loud. That now they said, "Fuck it, we have you guys. Well, we're going to train you to be soldiers now. Do something, add some value," and that they have a better army or better military than those countries which are rough and sterile. And it might be even talking about decadence, right? A country that's too prosperous creates weak people. A case in point is the kingdom of Egyptians, which, notwithstanding the amenities of the land, imposed the need to work so successfully by means of laws that it produced most excellent men, whose names, if they had not been lost in antiquity, would be even more celebrated than that of Alexander the Great, and than those of many others whose memory is still fresh. Um, it is more prudent to place a city in a fertile situation, provided its fertility is kept in due bounds by laws. I thought that was fascinating. Um, um, Now, he talked about Romulus. They will also recognize, as we shall presently point out, under what strict discipline it was placed by the laws made by Romulus, Numa, and others, and that in consequence neither its fertile situation, the convenience afforded by the sea, its frequent victories, nor the greatness of its empire were for many centuries able to corrupt it, but that these laws kept it so rich in virtue that there has never been any other city or any other republic so well adorned. So he's saying like he's saying a new city established. It's better to establish a new city that's barren but has fertile land, so you can get your people to work and stay busy, so they're not corrupted or become tyrannical or get the idea that they could take over. But when your land becomes fertile enough, and you guys have leisure, and you guys you have all you need, you're gonna need to establish laws. He's gonna get somewhere. So number two of this book one, the best form of government. Number two is how many kinds of state there are and of what kind was that of Rome. This is interesting right here. Okay, happy indeed should we call that state which produces man so prudent that men can live securely under the laws which he prescribes without having to amend them. Sparta, for instance, observed its laws for more than 800 years without corrupting them and without any dangerous disturbance. Um, Unhappy, on the other hand, in some degree, is that city to be deemed which, not having chance to meet with a prudent organizer, has to reorganize itself. And of such, that is the more unhappy which is the more remote from order, and that is the more remote from order whose institutions have missed altogether the straight road which leads to its perfect and true destiny. So order. For it is almost impossible that states of this type should by any eventuality be set on the right road again, whereas those which, if their order is not perfect, have made a good beginning and are capable of improvement, may become perfect should something happen with which provides the opportunity. Should, however, be noted that they will never introduce order without incurring danger, because few men ever welcome new laws setting up a new order in the state unless necessity makes it clear to them that there is need for such laws. And since such a necessity cannot arise without danger, the state may easily be ruined before the new order has been brought to completion. The Republic of Florence bears this out. Um, okay, now he gets to his intent. It being now my intention to discuss what were the institutions of the city of Rome and what events conduce to its perfection, I would remark that those who have written about states say that there are to be found in them one of three forms of government, called by them principality, aristocracy, and democracy, and that those who set up a government in any particular state must adopt one of them as best suits their purpose. Others, and with better judgment may think, say that there are six types of government, of which three are very bad, and three are good in themselves but easily become corrupt, so that they too must be classed as pernicious. Those that are good are the three above mentioned: principality, aristocracy, democracy. Those that are bad are the other three, which are principality, no, which are tyranny. So principality easily becomes tyranny. Okay, so those that are bad are the other three, which depend on the good, and each of them is so like the one associated with it. So each of the good are like each of the bad that they're related to, that easily passes from one form to the other. So principality, which is considered to be one of the good, eventually becomes tyranny. Aristocracy eventually becomes oligarchy, and democracy eventually becomes anarchy. If anyone who is organizing a commonwealth sets up one of the three first forms of government, one of the good ones, he sets up what will last but for a while, since there are no means whereby to prevent its passing into its bad form of government, on account of the likeness which in such a case virtue has to vice. So he's analogous to the fact virtue has to vice. Um, these variations of government among men are due to chance. From the beginning of the world, when its inhabitants were few, they lived for a time scattered like beasts. Then with the multiplication of their offspring, they drew together, and in order to better, and in order, or and in order the better to be able to defend themselves, began to look out. In order the better to be able to defend themselves, began to look about for a man stronger and more courageous than the rest, made him their head, and obeyed him. It was thus that men learned how to distinguish what is honest and good from what is pernicious and wicked, for the sight of someone injuring his benefactor evoked in them hatred and sympathy, and they blamed the ungrateful and respected those who showed gratitude, well aware that these same injuries might have been done to themselves. That's very important, right? The golden rule. That's the argument against artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has no intent. It doesn't understand the human emotions. Hence, to prevent evil of this kind, they took to making laws and to assigning punishments to those who contravened them. The notion of justice thus came into being. In this way, it came about that when later on they had to choose a prince, they did not recourse to the boldest as formerly, but to one who excelled in prudence and justice. So when they were barbarian, they had someone who was just strong and powerful, and now they needed someone with prudence and justice. But when at yet later stage they began to make the prince hereditary instead of electing him, his heirs soon began to degenerate as compared with their ancestors, and forsaking virtuous deeds, considered that princes have naught else to do but to surpass other men in extravagance, lasciviousness, and every other form of licentiousness. So obviously having all the extravagance leads to corruption and greed, and lasciviousness and licentiousness means to be more carnal, all about the flesh, sex and partying and drugs. And so your whole community becomes decadent, with the result that the prince came to be hated, and since he was hated, came to be afraid, and from fear soon passed to offensive action, which quickly brought about a tyranny. This is principality, like a monarchy, like princes rule, family dynasties. And so with that, the same king who quote unquote self-made, what happens is every other generation after that, which he gives power to, has to be his family, become degenerate. They're not as virtuous and prudent. They've been spoiled their whole life. They're corrupted, and that, and then because of that, the citizens begin to hate him. And then because he's hated, he becomes afraid, and from fear soon passed to offensive action, which quickly brings about a tyranny, from which before long was begotten the source of their downfall. For tyranny gave rise to conspiracies and plots against princes, organized not by timid and weak men, but by men conspicuous for their liberality, men who were known for their way of life, remember. So this is fascinating here. So after the tyranny, before long was begotten the source of their downfall, for tyranny gave rise to conspiracies and plots against princes. People trying to overthrow revolution, organized not by timid and weak men, but by men conspicuous for their liberality, magnanimous, very forgiving of what people do, and wealth and ability. So popular men of popular powerful men of this sort of government are the ones funding the revolution, pretty much. For such men cannot stand the dishonorable life the prince was leading. The masses, therefore, at the instigation of these powerful leaders, these conspicuous, powerful, like Elon Musk, he just started funding, like what they say, what's his name? George Soros does. They say he funds money for all these NGOs and these funded protesters. So these conspicuous men of liberality and magnanimity and wealth and ability, they can't stand such corrupt princes. So the masses, therefore, at the instigation of these powerful leaders, took up arms against the prince, and when he had been liquidated, submitted to the authority of those whom they looked upon as their liberators. Hence the latter, to whom the very term soulhead had become odious, formed themselves into a government. Moreover, in the beginning, mindful of what they had suffered under a tyranny, they ruled in accordance with the laws which they had made, subordinated their own convenience to the common advantage, and both in private matters and public affairs governed and preserved order with the utmost diligence. But when the administration passed to their descendants, who had no experience of the changeability of fortune, had not been through bad times, and instead of remaining content with the civic equality then prevailing, reverted to avarice, ambition, and to seizing other men's womenfolk. So they became just like the princes, lascivious, licentiousness, and extravagance. They caused government by an aristocracy to become governed by an oligarchy, in which civic rights were entirely disregarded, like bureaucratic. So that in a short time there came to pass in their case the same thing as happened to the tyrant, for the masses, sick of their government, were ready to help anyone who had any sort of plan for attacking their rules or their rulers, and so there soon arose someone who, with the aid of the masses, liquidated them. And since the memory of the prince and of the injuries inflicted by him was still fresh, and since having got rid of the government by the few, they had no desire to return to that of a prince, they turned to a democratic form of government, which they organized in such a way that no sort of authority was vested either in a few powerful men or in a prince. And since all forms of government are to some extent respected at the outset, this democratic form of government maintained itself for a while, but not for long, especially when the generation had organized it had passed away. For anarchy quickly supervened, in which no respect was shown either for the individual or for the official, and which was such that, as everyone did what he liked, all sorts of outrages were constantly committed. The outcome was inevitable, either at the suggestion of some good man, or because this anarchy had to be got rid of somehow, principality was once again restored. And from this, there was stage by stage a return to anarchy by way of the transitions and for the reasons assigned. It's a fucking cycle. This then is the cycle through which all commonwealths pass, whether they govern themselves or are governed. But rarely do they return to the same form of government, for there can scarce be a state of such vitality that it can undergo often such changes and yet remain in being. What usually happens is that while in a state of commotion in which it lacks both counsel and strength, a state becomes subject to a neighboring and better organized state. Were it not so, a commonwealth might go on forever passing through these governmental transitions. I maintain then that all the forms of government mentioned above are far from satisfactory. The three good ones because their life is so short, and the three bad ones because of their inherent malignity. Hence, prudent legislators, aware of their defects, refrained from adopting as such any one of these forms, and chose instead one that shared in them all, since they thought such a government would be stronger and more stable. For if in one and the same state there was principality, aristocracy, and democracy, each would keep watch over the other. Lycurgus is one of those who had earned no small measure of praise for constitutions of this kind, for in the laws which he gave to Sparta, he assigned to the kings, to the aristocracy, and to the populace each its own function, and thus introduced a form of government which lasted for more than 800 years, to this very great credit and to the tranquility of that city. But let us come to Rome. In spite of the fact that Rome had no Lycurgus to give it at the outset such a constitution as would ensure it to a long life of freedom, yet owing to a friction between the plebes and the Senate, the lower class, the common people, and to those in the Senate, so many things happened that chance affected what had not been provided by lawgiver. So that if Rome did not get fortune's first gift, it got its second, for her only institutions, though defective, were not on wrong lines, and so might pave the way to perfection. For Romulus and the rest of the kings made many good laws, quite compatible with freedom. But because their aim was to found a kingdom, not a republic, when the city became free, it lacked many institutions essential to the preservation of liberty, which had to be provided, since they had not been provided by the kings. In the republic, then, at this stage, there were the consuls and the senate, so that as yet it comprised but two of the aforesaid estates, namely principality and aristocracy. It remained to find a place for democracy. This came about when the Roman nobility became so overbearing, for reasons which will be given later, that the populace rose against them, and they were constrained by the fear that they might lose all to grant the populace a share in the government. The Senate and the consuls retaining, however, sufficient authority for them to be able to maintain their position in the republic. It was in this way that the tribunes of the plebes came to be appointed, and their appointment did much to stabilize the form of government in this republic, for in its government all three estates now had a share. So the plebes, no, the plebes are the working class, the lower classes, the poor people, the common people. And it's talking about the establishment. They appointed them tribunes. Tribunes are representatives of these poor people, right? Maybe a vote through vote. They're the face of the poor. And he's saying that little one effect was the cause for the establishment of a decent run government that could last. It wouldn't go through this cycle. And so favored was it by fortune that, though the transition from monarchy to aristocracy and thence to democracy took place by the very stages and for the very reasons laid down earlier in this discourse, nonetheless the granting of authority to the aristocracy did not abolish altogether the royal estate, nor was the authority of the aristocracy wholly removed when the populace was granted a share in it. On the contrary, the blending of these estates made a perfect commonwealth. And since it was friction between the plebes and the Senate that brought this perfection about, in the next two chapters we shall show more fully how this came to be.